My husband left me stranded in a foreign country with no money, no visa, and no name on the lease. Then texted, "You'll figure it out. You're resourceful." When I begged him to help me get home, he said, "That's your problem now. I'm not your babysitter." I just stared at my phone. That was 6 months ago. This morning, he was standing outside my apartment in tears. My husband left me abroad to teach me a lesson. So I learned to survive without him, and now he is begging for a comeback. I have been married to my husband Dan for 6 years. We met when I was working locally, and he was the charming guy who always seemed so protective, until I learned the hard way that his protection was really control. We moved abroad 2 years ago for his job. He promised me, "It'll be our fresh start. I'll take care of everything. You won't have to worry about a thing." I gave up my stable job, sold my car, and left my family behind. I trusted him. When we arrived, things were fine at first. I was job hunting, but Dan kept saying, "Don't rush. I make enough for both of us." But then, whenever I bought something as small as coffee, he'd make comments like, "Must be nice to spend money you didn't earn." He refused to put my name on the lease because it's just easier this way. He said it was temporary, but every time I brought it up, he'd laugh and say, "Why do you need your name there? You're with me." Whenever I made friends, he'd complain they were bad influences and didn't really care about me. He wanted me to stay home so he'd know I was safe. 4 months ago, we had a fight because I asked him to help me with some paperwork so I could apply for a work permit. He told me, "Why do you need to work? Are you saying I can't provide for you? Or are you planning to leave me once you have money?" I told him I just wanted independence. He snapped, "If you wanted independence, you shouldn't have married me." From that day, things got tense. He'd leave for hours without telling me where he was. He started locking his phone. One evening, I came home from the grocery store to find some of his things missing. His work bag, a suitcase, a few clothes. I called him, but he didn't answer. Hours later, he sent a short message. I went back home. "Don't worry, you'll be fine." I froze. I was in a foreign country, my visa tied to his sponsorship, my name not on anything. I asked what he meant. He replied, "You'll figure it out. You're resourceful." No explanation, no discussion. He had booked himself a ticket back to our home country without telling me. When I tried calling again, he sent voice messages like, "Stop acting like a victim. I left because you're impossible to live with. And you always complain about being stuck. Now you can see what it's like to actually be on your own." I was terrified. I had enough cash for maybe 2 weeks of food. I called the landlord, but he said since my name wasn't on the lease, I had no legal standing. I begged Dan to at least give me time to sort out my visa and living situation. He said, "That's your problem now. I'm not your babysitter." He told mutual friends I was crazy and dramatic, saying I'd probably follow him crying if I really loved him. I realized I had 2 choices, breakdown or fight. I went to the embassy and explained my situation. They connected me with a local women's support group. They helped me with temporary housing and legal advice. I started cleaning houses to earn quick cash, all while Dan sent me occasional messages, alternating between fake concern and insults. "I hope you're eating. You're too sensitive to survive out there. See? I told you you'd be fine without me. You didn't need me after all, unless you did. When you're ready to apologize, maybe I'll think about letting you come back." The worst part? He never once asked if I was safe. Last month, I finally got my own small apartment with the help of one of the women I met. Then Dan called. Not texted. Called. He said, "I think we should try again. I'll send for you. It's not the same here without you." When I didn't answer right away, he added, "Don't be stubborn. You know you can't build a life there without me." I laughed. For the first time in years, I really laughed. I told him, "You left me here with nothing. I've built everything I have now without you. Why would I go back to someone who abandoned me?" He started yelling, saying I was throwing away our marriage over a misunderstanding. Then he slipped back into gaslighting. "I didn't abandon you. I gave you freedom. You just didn't know how to handle it." I hung up. I blocked him everywhere. A few days ago, I posted a picture of my new apartment online. Just a small kitchen with sunlight coming through the window. Friends messaged saying it looked cozy. A mutual friend told me Dan saw it and lost his temper because I looked too happy. That's when I knew I had truly won. He left me thinking I'd crumble without him. Instead, I learned to stand on my own in a place where I had nothing. I'm staying abroad for now. My visa situation is almost sorted, and I have steady cleaning clients. I walk the streets without someone checking my every move. I drink coffee without being shamed for spending his money, and I sleep knowing no one will disappear in the night and leave me stranded again. Yesterday, as I was walking home from work, I felt someone following me. I turned the corner and I saw Dan. He said, "You didn't think I'd let you go that easily, did you?" My blood went cold and I could smell his cologne, that same expensive stuff he always wore. I gripped my keys between my fingers like I'd learned in the self-defense class at the shelter. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I backed away slowly toward the corner shop where Mr. Novak always worked evenings. Dan stepped closer and his smile made my skin crawl. I turned and ran into the store, the little bell above the door ringing like an alarm. Mr. Novak looked up from his newspaper and his warm smile disappeared when he saw my face. Dan walked in behind me, all charm and fake concern. He told Mr. Novak he was my husband, that we'd had a little disagreement but he'd come all this way to take me home. Mr. Novak looked at me and asked in his broken English if I needed help. I couldn't speak, but I managed to say the Czech word for police that Marta had taught me. Mr. Novak grabbed his phone immediately and stepped between me and Dan. Dan's nice guy mask slipped and he hissed at me to stop making a scene. He said we were married and we just needed to talk. He reached for my arm, but Mr. Novak pushed him back, speaking rapid Czech into his phone. 2 police officers showed up in less than 5 minutes since the station was just 3 blocks away. Dan switched right back to worried husband mode, pulling out his phone to show our marriage certificate. He kept saying this was all a misunderstanding, that his wife was confused. The officers looked at me and I pulled out my residence permit with shaking hands. I showed them Dan's messages on my phone, the ones where he said I'd figure it out and that I was resourceful. The younger officer's face got hard when he read them. They called for someone who spoke better English, and Detective Lucas Brenner arrived 20 minutes later. He separated us right away, taking Dan to one corner while another officer stayed with me. I showed Lucas everything, the documentation from the women's shelter, my work papers from Elena's cleaning service, screenshots of all Dan's messages. My hands wouldn't stop shaking and I kept dropping papers. They took us both to the station in separate cars. I sat in a small room by myself, hearing Dan's voice through the thin walls. He was telling them I was unstable, that I'd refused to come home with him, that he was just a concerned husband. I texted Marta with fingers that could barely type the words. She showed up in less than an hour with a thick folder of papers. She had copies of my shelter intake forms, photos they'd taken when I first arrived looking half-starved, statements from the staff about how Dan had abandoned me. She sat next to me and held my hand while we waited. Lucas came back after what felt like forever with a frustrated look on his face. He explained that Dan had booked a room at the Hotel Imperial for 2 weeks, and legally they couldn't make him leave Prague. They'd warned him about the stalking laws and told him he had to stay at least 100 meters away from me. Dan would have to go to court if he wanted to challenge it, but for now, that was all they could do. The station door slammed open and Elena rushed in with her cleaning uniform still on, and her face red with anger. She grabbed my shoulders and looked me over like she was checking for injuries before turning to Lucas. "This man left her with nothing in a foreign country," she said. Lucas nodded and explained the situation while Elena's hand stayed on my shoulders. She pulled me aside and told me I was coming to stay with her and her husband Pavel. I started to protest, but she cut me off with a look that reminded me of my mom. We drove to her house in silence while I watched the mirrors for Dan's rental car. Elena's house was small but warm with photos everywhere and the smell of something cooking. Pavel came out of the kitchen wiping his hands on a dish towel, and Elena spoke to him quickly in Czech. He nodded and went to get blankets while Elena showed me to their spare room. That night, I lay awake checking the locks on the bedroom door every hour and jumping at every car that passed. My phone buzzed with texts from unknown numbers, and I knew it was Dan getting new SIM cards. The messages said the same things over and over about needing to talk and not being dramatic. I deleted them and emailed James at the embassy with screenshots and updates about Dan being in Prague. The next morning, Pavel was already up installing a security camera by their front door while Elena made breakfast. I helped her load cleaning supplies into her van while my phone kept buzzing with more messages. Dan had found more numbers and was sending texts saying I was still his wife and we needed to work things out. Elena saw my hands shaking and took the phone to look at the messages. She called Lucas again while Pavel finished with the camera and showed us how to check the feed on our phones. That sudden appearance around the corner feels awfully convenient timing. How long has Dan been watching her movements to know exactly where she'd be walking home from work? The way he immediately tries to charm Mr. We drove to our first cleaning job at an office building near the city center. I was mopping the lobby when I saw it through the glass doors. Dan's rental car parked across the street. He was sitting in the driver's seat watching the building and taking photos with his phone. My hands started shaking so bad I dropped the mop handle and it crashed against the floor. Elena came running and saw where I was looking. She pulled out her phone to call the police while I took photos of Dan sitting there. Lucas arrived 20 minutes later and walked over to Dan's car while we watched from inside. Dan rolled down his window and I could see him gesturing and pointing at the building. Lucas stood there for a long time talking to him and then made him hand over his phone. Dan deleted something while Lucas watched and then started his car and drove away slowly. Lucas came back inside and explained that Dan claimed he was just sightseeing and happened to park there. The law said he had to stay 100 meters away, but technically the street was public property. That evening, Elena drove me back to her house and I finally video called my sister Emma back home. She started crying the second she saw my face and told me Dan had been calling everyone. He'd been telling family members I had mental problems and needed professional help. Emma said our aunt believed him and kept asking if I was taking medication. The next morning, Elena had to go to the women's shelter for a meeting with Marta about another client. I stayed at the house with Pavel, but then Marta called Elena's phone sounding panicked. Dan had shown up at the shelter asking about me and demanding to know where I was staying. Marta had refused to let him in and called security, but he stood outside with a cardboard sign. The sign said, "I'm sorry," in Czech, and he was telling people passing by that his wife had left him. Some people were stopping to listen to his story about flying all this way to apologize. Security finally made him leave, but not before several people took photos of him with his sign. That afternoon, James called from the embassy with news that made my stomach drop. Dan had filed an official complaint claiming I stole money from our joint account before he left Prague. James said the embassy needed bank statements and documentation to prove the money was mine. I had to dig through my email to find old statements while James stayed on the phone. The next day, Elena got 2 cancellation calls from regular cleaning clients. They said they didn't need service anymore, but Elena knew something was wrong. She checked her business website and found messages in the contact form from someone claiming to be my concerned husband. Dan had been writing to all her clients saying I was unstable and shouldn't be trusted in their homes. Elena called each client back to explain, but 2 of them had already hired someone else. My phone buzzed with a text from Fatima, who lived in my old apartment building. She said a man claiming to be my relative had been asking other tenants about my schedule. He wanted to know what time I usually came home and if I lived alone now. The building manager had already told him to leave once, but he kept coming back. Fatima sent me a photo she took from her window of Dan standing by the building entrance with a notebook. 3 days passed before I could even think about going back to my Czech language classes at the community center. I sat in the back row trying to focus on verb conjugations, but my hand kept moving on its own, writing the same 3 words over and over in my notebook. He won't win, he won't win, he won't win. The pen pressed so hard it tore through the paper in places. Every time the door opened, my whole body tensed up. A man walked in late, and I grabbed my phone ready to call Lucas until I saw it was just another student looking for a seat. My classmates kept glancing at me when I jumped at every sound. The teacher asked if I was okay, and I nodded, but my hands were shaking so bad I dropped my pen twice. When class ended, I packed up fast and headed for the door, but stopped dead when I saw him through the window. Dan stood outside the community center holding a huge bunch of red roses like we were on some romantic date. My fingers fumbled with my phone as I called Lucas while backing away from the exit. Dan saw me through the glass and smiled, holding up the flowers and pointing at them like I should be happy about this. Lucas answered on the second ring and told me to stay inside while he sent someone over. I watched Dan pace outside, staying exactly at the edge of the property line. When the police car pulled up, Dan walked backward down the street, maintaining that exact 100-meter distance the restraining order required. The officer couldn't do anything since technically Dan wasn't breaking the law. He followed me all the way to the tram stop, counting his steps to stay legal, those stupid roses still in his hand. That night, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, it was Rob, Dan's brother. He sounded worried and said Dan had called him asking to wire money to Prague, which seemed weird. Rob wanted to know what was really going on because something didn't add up. I told told him about the restraining order and the stalking, and Rob went quiet for a long moment. Then he told me something that made my stomach drop. Dan had been fired from his job 2 months ago for harassing a coworker. 2 months ago, when he was still sending me those messages about how well he was doing without me. Rob said Dan had been living in his basement and borrowing money, claiming he was between contracts. The next morning, Elena called me crying. Her biggest client, a property management company that handled half the buildings we cleaned, had terminated their contract. Someone sent them an anonymous email with screenshots that made it look like I had a criminal record for theft and fraud. The images were obviously fake, but the damage was done. Elena lost 40% of her business income in one email. She wasn't mad at me, but I could hear the panic in her voice about making rent and paying her other workers. Marta set up an emergency meeting that afternoon with Elena and a lawyer named Dr. Teresa Vogt, who specialized in harassment cases. We sat in Marta's office going through everything, documenting each incident with dates and times. Teresa took notes on her laptop, asking specific questions about the restraining order violations and the defamation. She said we had grounds for both criminal charges and a civil suit, but we needed more evidence of the pattern. Elena showed her the email to her client, and Teresa immediately started drafting cease and desist letters. While we were meeting, my mom called 5 times. When I finally answered, she was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. Dan had sent her photos of himself standing outside my apartment building looking thin and disheveled, claiming he was trying to rescue me from a dangerous neighborhood. He told her I was mixed up with bad people and needed help getting home. My mom begged me to go back with him, saying he looked so worried and sad in the pictures. She kept saying he was still my husband, and marriage meant working through problems together. I tried explaining about the stalking and harassment, but she just cried harder, asking what I had done to make him act this way. The next day, things got worse. I was checking my email when I noticed someone had logged into our old shared cloud storage account. Dan had downloaded every photo from our marriage, including private ones from our honeymoon and vacations. The login was from a Prague IP address. My hands went cold as I realized what he could do with those pictures. Teresa filed for an emergency digital restraining order that afternoon, but we both knew the damage he could cause before any legal protection kicked in. I couldn't eat or sleep just waiting for those photos to appear somewhere online. Elena asked me to help her clean a diplomatic residence the next morning, saying the routine work might help calm my nerves. The ambassador's wife was home and noticed I looked upset. While Elena cleaned upstairs, she made me tea and asked if I was okay. Something about her kind face made me tell her everything. She listened without judgment, then told me about her own escape from an abusive marriage 20 years ago. She wrote down the name of an international women's rights organization that had helped her and said they had resources even for cases crossing borders. That afternoon, a homeless man knocked on Elena's door with a package. Inside was my old passport that Dan had reported lost 2 years ago, my grandmother's emerald ring that he claimed was stolen during our move, and a note in his handwriting. See how easy it was to keep these from you? Come back and I'll give you everything. Elena called the police, but the homeless man was long gone, probably paid cash to make the delivery. Lucas came by the next day with bad news. Dan had hired a Czech lawyer and was filing paperwork claiming I had abandoned our marriage. He was telling the court that I refused to return home with him and was having an affair with someone in Prague. Lucas said Dan was building a case that I was an unfit wife who left the marriage to party abroad. The lawyer Dan hired was known for taking sketchy cases and twisting facts. Lucas warned me this could affect my visa status if Dan convinced the court I had violated the terms of our marriage. The next day, I walked into my Czech language class and froze when I saw Dan sitting in my usual spot, chatting with my classmates about our marriage. He was telling everyone how we were working things out and how he'd come all this way to support me through our reconciliation journey. My classmates looked confused as they glanced between us, and I stood there in the doorway unable to move or speak. Mrs. Kratochvil, our teacher, noticed my face and walked over to Dan, suggesting he might be more comfortable in the advanced class down the hall. Dan's playing chess while everyone else is following the rules of checkers, hiring sketchy lawyers, faking theft claims, and now cosplaying as a supportive husband in Czech class. Dan shook his head and said he needed to stay close to his wife for support, reaching for my hand as I backed away. 2 of my classmates, women who'd become friends over the past weeks, quietly shifted their seats to create a barrier between Dan and my usual spot. I sat down between them while Dan kept talking about our relationship to anyone who would listen, his voice getting louder each time I refused to look at him. The class went on for 2 hours with Dan interrupting constantly to ask me questions in front of everyone, pretending we were a happy couple. When class ended, I rushed out first, but Dan followed me down the street, calling my name until other students stepped between us. 3 days later, I was walking back to my apartment when I heard shouting and saw Dan on the ground outside my building, clutching his chest. Paramedics were already arriving, and Dan was gasping that his wife needed to come with him to the hospital. I told the paramedics I wasn't going anywhere with him, and that's when Dan sat up straighter and told them I was mentally ill. He said I was neglecting him and refusing to help even though he was having chest pains from the stress I'd caused. Fatima appeared at her window above us and came down immediately, speaking to the paramedics in perfect Czech. She told them about Dan following me for days, about the restraining order process, about how he'd been stalking me. The paramedics looked at Dan, whose breathing had suddenly gotten much better once he realized I wasn't coming with him. They checked his vitals and found nothing wrong, then left after warning him about false emergency calls. That night, I couldn't sleep in Elena's guest room, just scrolling through old messages from friends back home on my phone. Half of them had stopped responding to me completely over the past few months. The ones who did write sent short, careful messages asking if I was okay, but nothing more. I started seeing the pattern in their messages, how they'd all gotten distant around the same time Dan started telling people I was difficult. He'd been turning them against me for months before he left me here, laying the groundwork for his story. My phone rang at 2 in the morning, and it was Rob, Dan's brother, calling from back home with something urgent. He said he'd been doing some digging after our last conversation and found out Dan had been living with a woman named Cheryl. Rob sent me screenshots from social media showing Dan and this woman together at restaurants, at her apartment, calling each other engaged. The dates on the posts went back 2 months, right when Dan was telling everyone that I had abandoned our marriage. I stared at the photos of Dan smiling with his arm around this woman while I'd been sleeping on shelter floors. The next morning, I showed everything to Teresa at the legal aid office, and she immediately recognized this as fraud. She started filing emergency paperwork with Czech authorities and contacted a lawyer in my home country about the bigamy situation. Dan's legal position had just gotten dangerous because he'd been claiming abandonment while actively living with another woman. She said this changed everything about his claims against me and could even lead to criminal charges against him. James called me that afternoon from the embassy to expedite my independent visa application based on this new evidence. He said Dan's deception and abandonment were now documented, and I qualified for emergency processing of my paperwork. He warned me that Dan might try to leave the country fast once he found out about the legal problems heading his way. 2 days later, I was at Elena's cleaning service office helping with scheduling when the door slammed open. Dan walked in with 2 large men who he said were investigators looking into my theft of his property. Elena took one look at the men and recognized them as local thugs who hung around the bars causing trouble. Her husband Pavel moved to block the door while Elena grabbed her phone and called the police immediately. Dan kept yelling that I'd stolen from him, and these men were there to search the office for his things. The 2 men started moving toward the desk where I was standing, but Pavel stepped in front of them. Elena was speaking rapid Czech to the police, giving our address and describing the 3 men who were threatening us. Within 10 minutes, Lucas arrived with 2 other officers and immediately recognized the 2 men with Dan from previous arrests. They arrested all 3 for intimidation and attempted extortion, while Dan screamed that I was lying about everything. At the police station, Dan completely lost control when he saw me giving my statement to another officer. He started screaming that I was nothing before him and would be nothing without him, his face red with rage. Several people in the station pulled out their phones and recorded him yelling these things while Lucas had to physically restrain him. The video of Dan screaming at me while in handcuffs would later become evidence in multiple legal proceedings against him. 3 days later, they finally let me go back to my apartment while Dan sat in a detention cell waiting for his bail hearing. My hands shook as I put the key in the lock because I kept thinking about how he'd gotten in before. Fatima was already waiting in the hallway with a toolbox and new deadbolts she'd bought that morning. She helped me change every lock while telling me how Dan had knocked on every door in the building trying to find someone who'd believe his story about me being mentally unstable. Nobody did. The old couple from upstairs came down to check on me and said they'd seen right through him when he showed up acting all concerned. Even the building manager stopped by to say he'd already told the police about Dan trying to get a copy of my key by claiming he was my husband who'd locked himself out, while Fatima drilled the new locks into place. I noticed my neighbors had been keeping an eye on my door the whole time I was gone, because there were notes slipped under it telling me to call them if I needed anything. The next morning, Marta picked me up early to meet with someone named Teresa, who specialized in documenting abuse cases for court. We spent 6 hours in Teresa's office going through every email, text, and bank statement from the past 2 years. Teresa had this way of asking questions that made me remember things I'd pushed down, like how Dan had slowly moved money out of our joint account months before he left. She showed me how to create a timeline on this big whiteboard, marking every incident with different colored markers. Red for financial abuse, blue for isolation tactics, green for gaslighting. By the time we finished, the whole board was covered in colors. That's when we discovered Dan had been planning this for at least 4 months. He'd opened new bank accounts, transferred assets, even researched apartments back home while telling me we were building our future together in Prague. Teresa took photos of everything and said this pattern of premeditation would be crucial for the case. I was making coffee in my kitchen that evening when my phone buzzed with a Facebook message from someone named Cheryl. My stomach dropped when I saw her profile picture with Dan, his arm around her at what looked like a party from 2 weeks ago. She'd written this long message saying she'd just found out Dan was married and she was disgusted. She said Dan had told her I was his ex who refused to sign divorce papers and kept stalking him. She'd believed him until she saw a news article about his arrest in Prague. She had screenshots of their conversations going back 3 months, which meant he was dating her before he even abandoned me. She sent me everything, including photos of them together at restaurants I recognized from our bank statements, receipts from hotels, and messages where he called me crazy and claimed I was holding him back. In one message from the day after he left me, he'd written to her that I'd probably come crawling back within a week. Cheryl was furious and wanted to help however she could. She even offered to testify about his lies. The next day, day 12 according to Lucas's timeline, Dan made bail with a bunch of conditions. He couldn't contact me, had to surrender his passport, and couldn't leave Prague until the trial. Within 2 hours of his release, a lawyer showed up at my door with an envelope. I didn't open it right away, but when I did, it was a settlement offer. Dan wanted me to take 5,000 euros and sign a non-disclosure agreement about the abandonment. The lawyer stood there waiting for an answer while I read through 3 pages of legal language that basically said I could never tell anyone what really happened. I told the lawyer to leave and immediately called Lucas about the contact violation. He said Dan was playing games, using the lawyer as a middleman to avoid technically breaking the no contact order. The next morning, I had to go back to work because I still needed money to live. Elena had arranged for me to wear this small body camera that Teresa had given us, clipped inside my shirt pocket. Every time we arrived at a new house to clean, I'd freeze at the doorbell sound, my whole body tensing up. Elena noticed how I kept checking over my shoulder and started changing our route, avoiding empty houses and scheduling only apartments in busy buildings. She'd park where we could see the van from the windows and kept her phone ready to call the police. At one house, a man answered the door and I almost ran before realizing it was just the owner. Elena had to take over talking to clients because my hands shook too much to write down the schedules. She never complained, just quietly rearranged everything so I'd feel safer. On day 13, things got worse. Dan's lawyer filed a countersuit claiming I was the real abuser, that I was holding Dan hostage in Prague with false accusations to prevent him from returning to his job. Cheryl finding out through a news article about Dan's arrest seems oddly perfect timing, right when proof is needed most. Dan's chest-clutching performance for the paramedics makes me wonder how many times he's pulled that trick before. The papers said I was destroying his career and reputation out of spite. Teresa had warned me this might happen and called it DARVO, which meant deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. She said abusers often try to flip the story when they're cornered. The countersuit claimed I'd manipulated the police with fake tears and that Dan was the real victim. It even said I'd planned this whole thing to get revenge for him leaving me. The audacity of it made everyone at the support group angry, but Teresa stayed calm and said this desperate move actually showed Dan knew he was losing. Then something unexpected happened. Rob, Dan's brother, showed up at my apartment building carrying 2 cardboard boxes. I hadn't seen him since our wedding and almost didn't recognize him at first. He looked exhausted from the flight and said he'd come as soon as he heard what Dan had done. He'd brought boxes full of evidence, including Dan's real financial records that he'd hidden at their mother's house, printed emails where Dan had bragged about his plan to teach me a lesson, and most shocking of all, a termination letter from Dan's company. Dan had been fired 6 weeks ago for stalking a female coworker. Rob said he couldn't stand by and watch his brother destroy another woman's life. He'd already contacted Lucas and was ready to testify. The reunion between the brothers happened at Rob's hotel the next evening. Dan had somehow found out Rob was in town and showed up screaming in the lobby. The hotel security cameras caught everything as Dan grabbed Rob's shirt and shoved him against a wall. Rob stayed calm and kept his phone recording in his pocket while Dan threatened to ruin his life, to tell their mother lies about him, to make sure he'd regret choosing my side. The security guards had to pull them apart, and Dan was screaming that Rob was a traitor, that family was supposed to stick together. That's when Dan said the words that changed everything. He yelled that he'd only left me abroad to teach me a lesson, that I needed to learn my place, and that I should have come crawling back by now. Rob's phone captured every word in clear audio. The security guards wrote up a report and gave Rob a copy along with the security footage. On day 14, James from the embassy called me early in the morning to come in immediately. When I arrived, he had my new visa ready, completely independent from Dan's sponsorship. He said the mounting evidence had allowed them to fast-track the process. He also gave me a packet of information about pressing charges in our home country for fraud and abandonment. Apparently, Dan had claimed me as a dependent on his taxes while telling everyone we were separated, which was federal fraud. James had been working with authorities back home to build a case. He said Dan would likely face charges in both countries now. That evening, Elena and I sat in her small office after finishing our cleaning route, sharing tea from her thermos. She told me she'd been where I was 20 years ago, brought to Czech Republic by a man who promised her everything, then left her with nothing. She'd started her cleaning service specifically to hire women like us, women who needed work immediately without questions about their past. She showed me a photo album full of pictures of women who'd worked for her over the years, many who'd gone on to build their own businesses or careers. She said her company was never just about cleaning houses, it was about giving women a chance to stand on their own feet when someone had knocked them down. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings and paperwork. Marta's lawyer friend called me constantly with updates about the case building against Dan. She said prosecutors in Prague were working with officials back home to coordinate charges. Dan was facing serious trouble for stalking, intimidation, and hiring those men to scare me. Back in our home country, they were looking at fraud and abandonment charges too. The legal net was closing around him faster than I'd expected. Meanwhile, Dan's money situation got bad really quick. The fancy hotel where he'd been staying called the police station demanding payment because his credit card got declined. His lawyer told the court he needed more money up front to keep representing him. Dan tried to access our joint accounts but found out I'd legally frozen them while the investigation was happening. The look on his face in court when he realized he couldn't touch that money must have been something. Then Robert's wife called me with shocking news. She'd been digging around on social media and found something huge. Dan's first wife, the one he always said died in a car accident years ago, was actually alive and living in Canada. Her name was Sandra, and she'd remarried and had kids. Robert's wife had messaged her carefully, and Sandra was willing to talk about what Dan did to her. The next day, Dan made everything worse for himself. Despite having to surrender his passport as part of his bail conditions, he tried to run. Police caught him at the German border with a fake ID he'd somehow gotten. That violation meant immediate detention until his trial. I watched from Marta's lawyer's office as they confirmed his arrest over the phone. He was going straight to jail this time, no more bail. I had to go to the embassy to fill out paperwork to reclaim my legal independence. Sitting in that waiting room, I noticed my hands weren't shaking anymore like they used to, but I still checked every exit and looked at every face that came through the door. James sat with me for a while and said this was normal after what I'd been through. He said the feeling would fade with time, but it was okay to be careful. 2 days later, I had a video call with Sandra. She looked tired but determined as she told me her story. Dan had done the exact same thing to her 10 years ago. He'd isolated her from friends and family, drained her inheritance of almost $50,000, then disappeared when she started asking questions about where the money went. She'd rebuilt her whole life in Canada and wanted to help me. She said something that stuck with me. She said I was already stronger than I knew because I'd survived him and was still standing. Dan's lawyer tried a new strategy in court that was so crazy even the judge looked confused. He claimed I'd orchestrated everything to steal Dan's assets and get sympathy for immigration purposes. He said I'd set Dan up to look bad so I could stay in Prague. The judge actually asked him if he was serious, especially since Dan had just been caught with a fake passport trying to flee the country. Lucas called me with more evidence they'd found. Dan's laptop showed he'd been researching things for months before he left me. His browser history had searches like how to strand spouse abroad and abandonment laws Czech Republic from way back in January. He'd been planning this for half a year. The premeditation made everything look even worse for him. During all this legal stuff, I was still living my life. Fatima from next door started coming over in the evenings. I taught her some English words while she helped me with Czech pronunciation. We laughed so hard at my attempts to say certain words. One night I realized I hadn't laughed like that in years. Really laughed, not the fake polite laugh I'd learned to do around Dan. I was building a life he never thought I could have. The biggest break came when those 2 men Dan hired decided to make a deal with prosecutors. They revealed Dan had promised them money from my supposed inheritance. Problem was, I don't have any inheritance. My parents are regular working people with no money to leave anyone. The men had recordings on their phones of Dan describing his whole plan. He'd told them he needed to scare me enough that I'd come running back to him desperate and broken. He'd said once I was back under his control, he'd have access to my family money that he'd made up in his own head. The recordings were clear as day. Dan talking about making me so afraid I'd never try to leave again. The prosecutor's office took 3 days to review everything, and when they called me in on day 22, the lead lead prosecutor had this look on her face like she'd seen something that made her sick. She spread out all the evidence on the conference table and told me Dan was looking at serious prison time for abandonment, stalking, intimidation, conspiracy, fraud, and attempted flight from justice. The recordings alone were enough to convict him, but combined with everything else, she said it was one of the strongest cases she'd handled. I sat there staring at the papers and photos and transcripts and didn't feel happy or sad, just empty and tired. That night, Dan's mother called me crying so hard I could barely understand her words. She kept saying she knew Dan was difficult, but prison would destroy him and couldn't I please just drop the charges and come home. She admitted she'd always known he had problems with control, but said that was just how men in their family were, and I should have been more patient. I told her as gently as I could that Dan's choices had destroyed our marriage and nearly destroyed me, and I couldn't save him from the consequences of what he'd done. She hung up on me. The next morning, Elena called me with news that made me actually smile for the first time in weeks. The embassy had contacted her about a cleaning contract for all their offices and residential buildings. They'd been impressed with how she'd handled the whole situation with Dan and wanted to work with someone they could trust. The contract was worth 3 times what Dan had cost her when he scared away that client. 2 days later, I walked through the outdoor market near my apartment for the first time since Dan had shown up in Prague. My hands shook a little as I picked out vegetables and bread and cheese, things I wanted to eat instead of things Dan would have approved of. Rob showing up with boxes of evidence like he's delivering the world's worst care package for his brother. Happy Karma Day, Dan. Here's proof you're terrible. I bought peppers even though he hated them, and chocolate even though he said it made me fat, and wine even though he thought women who drank alone were pathetic. The vendor smiled at me and threw in some free herbs, and I walked home feeling like I'd won some small battle against the voice in my head that still sounded like him. The bail hearing happened the next week, and Dan completely lost it in the courtroom. He started screaming that the entire Czech legal system was conspiring with me against him, and that everyone had been bribed or threatened. His lawyer tried to calm him down, but Dan turned on him and fired him right there in front of the judge, saying he'd represent himself since everyone was against him anyway. The judge denied bail immediately and had Dan removed from the courtroom while he was still yelling about corruption and lies. I started teaching English at the shelter 2 days after that. Marta had asked if I'd be willing to help some of the other women who were trying to rebuild their lives. Most of them were refugees or abuse survivors like me, and they needed language skills to find work. The first class was just 3 women, but by the 3rd session we had 12. Marta pulled me aside after and said she'd never seen someone transform from victim to advocate so quickly, but I didn't feel transformed, just useful for the first time in years. Rob called me that weekend with news that made everything even worse for Dan. He'd been going through Dan's old credit card statements to help with a legal case and discovered Dan had opened 3 credit cards in my name before he abandoned me. He'd maxed them all out and never made a single payment. The debt was over $15,000, and it meant identity theft charges on top of everything else. Rob kept apologizing for not seeing who his brother really was, but I told him it wasn't his fault. The next week, I met with Teresa to prepare for the trial testimony. She had me practice telling my story over and over without apologizing or minimizing what happened. The first few times I kept saying things like maybe I misunderstood, or perhaps it wasn't that bad, but she stopped me every time. By the end of the session, I could say it clearly that Dan had abandoned me to break me, but I had refused to break. 2 days after that, I signed a new lease for my apartment with just my name on it. The landlord had been following the case in the local news and offered me a reduced rate. He said his daughter had been in a bad relationship once, and he was proud to rent to someone who'd found the strength to escape. It was the first legal document that was entirely mine since I'd gotten married, and my hand didn't shake at all when I signed it. Yesterday, a letter arrived through some lawyer Dan had met in detention. The lawyer said Dan wanted to offer me everything if I would drop the charges and tell the court it was all a misunderstanding. The letter itself violated the no-contact order and added another charge to his case. The prosecutor called it a gift because it showed Dan still didn't understand or respect legal boundaries even from jail. 3 days later, the prosecutor called to tell me Sandra was flying in from America to testify. She'd paid for her own ticket and wanted to meet me before the trial. We met at a small cafe near Wenceslas Square where she pulled out a thick folder of papers. She had emails, text messages, bank records going back 15 years showing Dan's pattern with her. He'd done the exact same thing to her in 2009 when they were living in Boston. Isolated her from friends, controlled the money, then left her stranded when she tried to get a job. The prosecutor was already building the case when more news came. A woman from Germany had contacted them after seeing Dan's name in the news. She dated him briefly in 2018 and filed a police report when he wouldn't stop following her. The pattern was so clear now that even Dan's lawyer looked uncomfortable reading it. My phone started buzzing with messages from family I hadn't heard from in years. My sister Emma texted that she'd booked a flight to Prague for next week. My mom called crying, saying Dan had been calling her for months before he left me. He'd been telling her I was unstable and she'd believed him. She kept apologizing over and over until I had to hang up. 2 days later, Lucas called with news that made my stomach drop. Dan had tried to hang himself in his cell using torn bed sheets. The guards found him in time and rushed him to the medical wing. His court-appointed lawyer was requesting a psychiatric evaluation, claiming Dan was having a mental breakdown. Some people at the support group said it was just manipulation, but I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking maybe I'd pushed too hard by pressing charges. Elena came by my apartment when she heard I wasn't eating. She sat with me and reminded me that Dan made his own choices. She said his actions weren't my fault. Not the abandonment, not the stalking, not this. But I still felt sick thinking about him in that cell. The psychiatric evaluation took 3 days, and the results helped me understand everything better. The psychiatrist said Dan had narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features. His pattern of abandoning and stalking women would likely continue without serious intervention. It wasn't about me or Sandra or the woman from Germany. It was about control, and when we escaped his control, he couldn't handle it. The same day the report came out, another woman showed up at the prosecutor's office. Her name was Cheryl, and she'd been dating Dan right before his arrest. She brought her laptop with his search history still saved in the browser. He'd been Googling things like teaching girlfriend lesson and making her miss me for weeks. She found her passport hidden in his apartment after he he was arrested. She was supposed to be his next victim. The prosecutor added her evidence to the growing pile. That afternoon, a letter arrived from my old boss. She'd heard about everything through mutual contacts and wanted me to know I had a job waiting if I wanted it. The letter said they'd pay for my relocation and help me get settled. I sat there holding it, realizing I actually had choices now. I could stay in Prague where I'd built a new life or go home on my own terms. Dan's new lawyer tried arguing Dan wasn't mentally fit to stand trial, but the prosecutor showed all the planning Dan had done before abandoning me. The plane ticket purchased weeks in advance, the money he'd moved out of our joint account gradually, the apartment lease he'd signed back home before leaving. Every detail showed clear thinking and planning, not mental illness. The judge denied the insanity plea and set the trial date for next month. Emma arrived at the Prague airport 3 days later, and I went to pick her up. When she saw me, she started crying and pulled me into the longest hug. I was speaking Czech with the taxi driver, and she kept staring at me like she was seeing someone new. She said I looked different, stronger, like I'd grown into myself finally. We went back to my apartment, and she couldn't believe I'd done all this on my own. The small kitchen, the plants on the windowsill, the job with Elena, the friends from the support group who kept checking on me. She kept saying she was proud of me, and sorry she hadn't seen what Dan was doing sooner. The next morning, Teresa called to say the trial date was set for next week, and I'd testify by video link so I wouldn't have to be in the same room as Dan. She'd arranged for a victim advocate to sit with me during testimony, and we spent the next few days going over everything that would happen. I was ready, but my hands shook whenever I thought about facing him again, even through a screen. 2 days before the trial, Dan's mother showed up at my apartment building, and the security guard called up to warn me. I went down to the lobby, and there she was holding a box of Dan's childhood photos and what looked like medical files. She started crying the moment she saw me and pushed the papers at me saying doctors had diagnosed Dan with conduct disorder as a child and he was sick, not evil. I looked at the reports about him hurting animals and setting fires and told her being sick didn't give him the right to hurt people. She begged me to drop the charges, but I stayed calm and said the court would decide what happened next. The morning of the trial, my English class students surprised me by organizing outside the courthouse with signs saying "Justice for Isabella" in Czech and English. Local reporters were there taking pictures and asking questions about the foreign woman who'd been abandoned and rebuilt her life. Elena and Marta stood with me as we watched the crowd grow, and I couldn't believe all these people cared about what happened to me. Inside the courthouse, Rob was giving his deposition to the prosecutor, and I could hear him through the door talking about animals Dan had hurt as a teenager. He described girlfriends who'd suddenly left town without explanation and patterns of control that went back years. The prosecutor was building a complete picture of who Dan really was, and Rob's voice cracked when he admitted he should have said something sooner. When the trial officially started, I watched on my screen as Dan appeared via video from detention, looking thin and tired, but still trying to smile at the judge. The prosecutor's opening statement laid out everything in detail from the abandonment to the stalking to the hired thugs. Dan kept shaking his head like none of it was true, but the evidence was all there in black and white. When it was my turn to testify, I sat in the small room with the victim advocate holding my hand under the table. I told them about finding his things gone and the message saying I'd figure it out. I described the nights without food and having to beg strangers for help and how he'd laughed when I called crying. Why does Dan's mother show up now with childhood medical records she's apparently been holding on to for decades? The timing feels convenient, bringing conduct disorder diagnoses right before the trial starts. My voice only broke once when I talked about learning to survive and finding strength I didn't know I had. The courtroom on the screen was completely silent when I finished. Dan demanded to cross-examine me himself, and the judge allowed it, which made my stomach turn. His questions showed exactly who he was as he asked, didn't he provide for me, and wasn't I happy when I didn't have to work? Each question made him look worse as I answered simply and honestly about the control and isolation. He got angry when I wouldn't agree that I'd been ungrateful and started shouting that I was twisting everything. The judge had to tell him 3 times to calm down before threatening to remove him from the video link. Sandra testified next about her experience with Dan and how he'd done the same thing to her years ago. Then Cheryl described all Dan's lies about me being crazy and following him home when really he'd been planning everything. The pattern was so clear that even Dan's court-appointed lawyer looked uncomfortable defending him. Dan started yelling that they were all lying and it was a conspiracy against him, but nobody was listening anymore. The prosecutor saved the best evidence for last and played Rob's recorded phone call where Dan admitted everything. Then came the browser history showing searches for how to make someone disappear and psychological torture techniques. The 2 thugs testified via video about Dan hiring them and showing them my photo. Finally, the prosecutor held up Dan's fake passport with a different name that he'd been carrying when arrested at the border. Dan completely lost it and started screaming that I deserved it for not being grateful for everything he'd done. He said I was nothing without him and would have died on the streets if he hadn't taken care of me. The judge called for order, but Dan kept ranting about ungrateful women who didn't know their place until the guards disconnected his video feed. The judge took less than an hour to deliver the verdict, and I watched on my screen as she read out guilty on all counts. Dan got 4 years in Czech prison for stalking, intimidation, conspiracy to commit assault, and attempted flight from justice. After serving his time, he'd be deported and face more charges back home for the financial crimes Rob had uncovered. I watched Dan's face crumble as the guards led him away, and felt something inside me finally let go of the fear I'd been carrying. The next morning, I met with a lawyer named Teresa at a small office near the courthouse to sign papers for getting back what Dan had hidden. She spread out documents showing bank accounts he'd opened without telling me, and safety deposit boxes with my grandmother's jewelry he'd claimed was lost. My hands shook as I signed each page while she explained how the court ordered everything returned, plus damages for what I'd suffered. The jewelry meant more than the money, because my grandmother had given it to me before she died, and Dan had no right to take it. When we finished, I walked out with copies of everything, but felt empty instead of happy, because getting things back didn't erase what happened. Outside the courthouse, Dan's mother was waiting by the steps, and I almost turned around, but she held up her hands to show she meant no harm. She told me she was sorry for not seeing what Dan was becoming, and for not getting him help when the signs were there. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked older than when I'd last seen her at our wedding 6 6 years ago. I accepted her apology but kept my distance because some bridges can't be rebuilt even with good intentions. Back at my apartment, I found my door covered in flowers and notes from neighbors with messages in Czech and English saying they were proud of me. Fatima had left a pot of soup outside my door with a note saying dinner was at 7 if I wanted company. The other neighbors had signed a card with little drawings and Czech phrases I was still learning to read. Emma helped me carry everything inside, and we sat on my couch reading each note while the soup warmed on the stove. 3 days later, I met James at the embassy to finish my permanent residency application, with all the new court documents proving my case. He showed me a memo about new protocols they were creating for abandoned spouses based on what happened to me. My case would help other women avoid the visa nightmare I'd faced when Dan left me stranded without legal status. He shook my hand and said the embassy would fast-track my application, given everything I'd been through this year. A week after the verdict, I walked back into Marta's shelter to teach my English class like nothing had changed. A new woman sat in the corner crying, and Marta whispered she'd been left by her boyfriend with no money or Czech language skills. I made tea and sat with her using simple English to explain that she would survive this even when it felt impossible. I gave her the same advice Marta had given me about taking each day as it came and finding strength in small victories. She squeezed my hand when I told her my story, and I saw the same fear I'd felt 6 months ago. Elena called that afternoon asking me to meet at a lawyer's office to sign partnership papers for the cleaning business. She wanted me handling the English-speaking clients and bookkeeping while she managed the Czech side of operations. The business would specifically hire women rebuilding their lives because we both knew how hard it was to start over. We shook hands over the signed contracts, and Elena said we'd already gotten 3 new corporate clients from my trial publicity. 2 weeks passed, and Emma packed her bags to fly home, but first we painted my apartment walls bright yellow. Dan had always said yellow was too cheerful and made him anxious, but now I could choose whatever I wanted. We painted all weekend and hung new curtains I'd bought at the market without asking anyone's permission. Emma helped me move furniture exactly where I wanted it and throw out anything that reminded me of my old life. The apartment finally felt like mine instead of a temporary hiding place from my past. A letter arrived from Sandra and Cheryl about an online support group they were starting for women abandoned abroad. They wanted me as a moderator to share my story and help others work through the system that had almost destroyed me. I typed my acceptance immediately and spent that night writing my first post about finding strength in the worst situation. The support group already had 50 members from different countries, all sharing similar stories of being left with nothing. Spring came to Prague, and I walked through Wenceslas Square without checking over my shoulder for the first time in months. I stopped at my favorite cafe and ordered in Czech that was getting better. Each week I practiced with neighbors. The waiter smiled when I got the pronunciation right and brought my coffee with a small cookie on the side. I opened my laptop and started writing my full story for the support group while tourists walked past my table. 6 months into my new life, I stood in the embassy, helping a scared woman fill out emergency paperwork after her husband disappeared. She asked if it really got easier, and I told her surviving wasn't about getting back what you lost. It was about discovering who you become when you refuse to let someone else's cruelty break you completely. I handed her Marta's business card and wrote my phone number on the back for when she needed someone who understood. Walking out of the embassy, I realized I'd built something Dan never thought I could have without him. I had my own business, an apartment, and friends who actually cared about my well-being instead of controlling me. The woman I was before would never recognize who I'd become through surviving the worst betrayal imaginable. My story wasn't about winning or getting revenge on someone who tried to destroy me. It was about learning that real strength comes from refusing to give up when someone leaves you with nothing. Dan thought abandoning me in Prague would teach me I needed him, but instead it taught me I never did. Alright, that's a wrap on this little commentary adventure. Appreciate you letting me crack a few jokes along the way. Subscribe for more content like this.